evening, everyone. Simon Jacobson here. I welcome you all. And in the spirit of the famous statement that we live with the times, the Jews have always been living with the times, and the times means not the New York Times, but the chapters in the Torah that we read during this time. And we look into it for spiritual guidance and direction, insight, based on the premise that the Torah is a blueprint for life, a spiritual blueprint, a psychological and emotional blueprint that helps illuminate the crevices of our own psyches. So whatever challenge we are facing or issues that we are struggling with, or for that matter, even not just our difficulties, but also our joys and our celebrations, that too needs that sometimes direction to celebrate and smile in a healthy manner. So we all know that in this dysfunctional world, we all can use some help in improving the way our attitudes and the way we react through to daily confrontations and slights and competition and all the different forces that that assault us on a constant basis. So we've all developed sophisticated and maybe not so sophisticated defense mechanisms to protect ourselves. Some of these mechanisms were developed when we were children and had to deal and cope with unstable or uncertain homes. We did not necessarily find the confidence and security that helps nurture the spirit. But however it goes, we live in a world where it's a hostile world. And sadly, sometimes even our good friends and people we thought were loyal to us can end up, for one reason or another, not necessarily being that loyal, can disappoint us, betray us. Whether it's because of their interest, self-interest, or because they found other benefits. So we live in a world where most of us really don't really know where the next curveball is going to come from. So our mechanisms that we use to cope with all of this is quite, as I said, elaborate, and sometimes so complex that we ourselves get enmeshed in our own mechanisms. And that's when we talk about having trouble in finding commitments and trouble with discovering healthy relationships, it ultimately comes down to, why should a human being have a problem finding a relationship? It should seem on paper, it should seem simple. But because we have many fears and we have many phobias, and many of them legitimate ones, and once you develop all kinds of mechanisms, it's hard to distinguish what's healthy, what's not healthy. So God forbid, it's like a disease that starts killing healthy cells with unhealthy cells. So even being open to somebody in your life that may be someone healthy, if you've been hurt enough, you sometimes can close off. It's like if you create a spam folder, ends up getting good mail in there too. So sometimes we put these defense mechanisms at the point that they screen out, filter out even some of the healthy forces in our lives. And then there's other extreme where you let everything into your life, and then there's a lot of spam and a lot of unhealthy relationships, unhealthy commitments. So bottom line is, in one word, it's a mess. Okay, I don't know about your lives, but people I meet and I see, and a lot of anxiety. And then when you throw into the equation, of course, economic uncertainties and challenges, especially not always necessarily financial. It can be actually really financial, but equally problematic is the psychological fears around it. when you've invested and put so much of your security in your money, and then it becomes uncertain, or potentially uncertain, it creates a whole upheaval in our what we call our security, what we think is something that's lasting. So all this is really just a general overview of, I guess, the human condition. I remember when I came back after my initial tour, and I wrote Toward a Meaning for Life. It's a long time ago, the mid-90s. I remember I came back to the class here, and everyone asked me, so what was it like to, what did you discover in across America? And my first reaction, which was just my gut reaction, was I discovered that people are miserable everywhere, not just in New York. So I'm not here to paint necessarily a negative picture. You all know your challenges internally. There's also a lot of beauty in this world. But the key is, how do we hold on to the beauty and make that the focus of our lives, and invest less energy in fighting the enemies, whether the perceived ones or the real ones, the internal ones or the external ones, the psychological ones or the tangible ones. Because if you really think about it, then that's something maybe we shouldn't think about, because it could be depressing. How much energy in the day is going toward bringing light into your life, or actually giving light into the world, and how much of it is fighting potential threats. Now remember, fighting a potential threat, I don't just mean a threat at work or a physical one. It could be the fears that you have that haunt you, and different paranoias and different concerns, as I said, whether they're legitimate or not. And when you start thinking about it, and you start seeing how much energy is invested, no wonder that often we're exhausted and we don't have any space for the good things in our lives. And then we say, you know what, it'll take me the next 5 years, I'll dedicate myself to get rid of as much garbage. And then after 5 years, remember, the more you invest in it, the more it becomes part of your life, and you become addicted to fighting your enemies, so to speak. So it's a vicious cycle here. All this is meant to be somewhat of an introduction, I would say, to the theme of this evening's discussion, which, following the theme of this chapter, so though the chapter has particular characters who lived in a particular time in history, in a particular part of the globe, but their story really is the story of our lives today, regardless of their name, regardless when it happened, regardless what part of the world. Because it's the universal and timeless challenge that we all face, is when we have to deal with adversarial forces in our lives, confrontations. And there's nobody in this world that has not had a situation like that, even though we don't like it and we don't welcome it necessarily. But it's inevitable that you're going to have in your life situations that are confrontational. Whether it's people that are just, that you can't avoid, that will confront you. Whether it's situations, whether it's due to different aspirations you have, and as you seek them you find resistance or some type of force that makes it difficult for you to get there. So the word adversary is a broad word which can conclude all types of challenges. As I said, from the human to the psychological to the even perceived challenges. Sometimes there are fears we have that are not even based on anything, but we think that there will be a confrontation. And each of us deals with confrontations in different ways. Often there's a pattern. There's a pattern because it's much of the tools that we've learned either at home or later through our own trial and error, through our mistakes and through experiences. Just to give a taste of the spectrum of different attitudes when it comes to confrontation. Now, some people avoid it like the plague. They'll do anything to avoid confrontation. They'll compromise. They'll allow themselves to be stepped on. They'll compromise themselves, compromise others. They just cannot handle the discomfort of a confrontation. No, I'm speaking in extremes, simply just to contrast purposes. Obviously, all of us are not necessarily extreme, somewhere in between. And then, of course, there's the other extreme of people who have become warriors, whether it's due to the fact that they've been fighting since they were children and just become so accustomed to it, they're even addicted to it. they're almost always looking for confrontations. They thrive on it. And we know what that means. A person like that develops all kinds of tools and manipulation, and perhaps even is very skilled at it. You don't want to meet a person like that either, because they're basically sharks. And then there are people who, in between and over and under. So it's a very big question. How do you deal with a situation that's potential conflict? Do you appease? Do you compromise? Do you negotiate? Do you retreat? Do you yield? Or do you battle? And it may sound like a simple question. We all know it's far from simple, particularly because there's no real formula for across the board. It depends on the conflict. It depends on the situation. Different situations warrant and require different attitudes. So, interestingly, we have here a model, a archetype or prototype of a template for the issue of challenges and confrontations. And if you read the Torah in general in this context, looking for its personal relevance, you'll find every chapter has its theme. You know, the chapters, for example, later will be in chapter Exodus, the first chapter, Shmos. Its theme is dealing with pain and suffering and bond and Mitzrayim and all forms of constraints. So one of the themes in this chapter is dealing with confrontation. That would be, you could call it the title, the relevant title. What is the actual story? The story is the classic battle of the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, who, from the moment that they were conceived, actually, in their mother's womb, Rivka, they're already at war. Vayishlach the kirba, that they were struggling in her womb. And she's told by God that you have two nations inside of you who forever, perpetually, will be at odds at each other's throats. and so it is. So it comes to be. They're born with different personalities. The Torah describes it very succinctly and very graphically and bluntly. This one's a warrior. Ish Melchama Yedid Tzayid is Esau, a warrior, a man of the war, a battler. Yedid Tzayid is an artist, actually, a craftsman at hunting. And Jacob is Ish Tam Yeshiv Ahalim. He's the so-called Tam, the wholesome one, the scholar, person who's an internal person. So if a warrior is going out there and conquering and driven by conquest, his is more introspective, more of a meditative, more of a spiritual person, if you wish. This is not, by no means should be interpreted as one is good or one is bad. There are two personalities that exist, and when tempered and when balanced, they both play a role. Because we live in a world that you need to have a certain element of warrior in you, because it's an untamed world. And if we didn't build shelters and didn't protect ourselves, we're exposed to the elements, whether it's natural elements or unnatural elements, that can hurt us. So there's something to be said to be able to fight the battles that you have to fight. However, you don't want to become identified with it to the point that that's all you are, as a warrior. On the other hand, the Jacob personality is the personality of really the one that focuses on what the purpose of life. And even after you fight your battles and you win, what do you do then? What is life about? The scholar is the introspective one. But the Torah pits these two against each other, or you could say history does, God does. As I said, even in their mother's womb, they are two adversarial forces. And in reading their story, you really can read the story of your own life. Because these two forces are within us, outside of us. Everywhere you turn, you'll find a Yaakov and a Esau. It's just, you need to be able to so-called decipher and strip the characters from their immediacy of when they lived or where they lived and their names even, and understand them as universal archetypes. And in that sense, you can apply that to any situation. And their story is the story of our lives, and their confrontations are confrontations of our lives, to the extent that where they also reconcile in this week's chapter. So before we get into the psychological and personal universal message, a little detail about what actually takes place in their lives. So as I said, they are born and conceived in struggle, and then continue to live a life like that. And the story is told, as we discussed a few weeks ago, how Jacob actually fools his brother, gets his blessings, gets his first birthright and then the blessings, and that whole episode, which of course infuriates Esau. But their battle didn't begin with that, because as I said, even in their mother's room they were at war. They were just, personality-wise, adversaries. Say adversaries or adversaries? Okay, good. Everybody said that. That was very good. You should make a clip for that on YouTube. You know? Adversaries or adversaries. I know with Caribbean, you can say Caribbean or you can say Caribbean. Right? Or is there a vote on that too? Is there a consensus? Huh? Good. So, when you look at their story, as I said, different aspects of it are reflected in our own situations. I'm going to focus obviously on the confrontation part. So we have that Jacob then has to escape, and for 20 years actually leaves his homeland, his parents' home. He also finds and builds his family there, which is another story of its own. But he leaves Israel and travels back to actually his roots, where Abraham originated from, a corrupt world where he has other confrontations with his father-in-law and so on. And then after 20 years returns. So last week's chapter concludes with those 20 years, where in those 20 years he had married, built a family, and he's now returning to Israel, unknowing what's going to happen with him and Esau. So this week's chapter opens in that moment of suspense, where after 20 years of his brother who was fuming at him for what he had done, and in general, as I said, they were constantly at war with each other, psychologically and philosophically and emotionally. Now, Jacob comes. And what does he do first? So the chapter begins, Vayishlach, Yaakov Malachim, he sends messengers ahead of him to see what's going on with Esau. He doesn't want to be surprised. So he sends messengers wisely to check it out. Scouts. Check out what's the mood of Esau, what's Esau doing. And they return, I'll just translate loosely here what he says. And he tells his messengers, please tell my brother that your servant your servant Jacob, he humbly calls himself like a servant, humble type of a certain acquiescent voice, that I've lived with my love and gati with my father-in-law Laban. I built a family, and I own now a lot of property. He impresses him with his wealth. Okay, and then continues, and I'm coming to greet you, my brother, and send you my best regards. And I hope I find pleasure in your eyes. So Jacob is anticipating. Obviously, he knew quite well what might come. So he sends his messengers to speak to his brother, and he also makes the point that I have wealth, and I have a whole so-called army. Even the messengers return and they say, "We came to your brother, and he is marching toward you with 400 men, 400 soldiers." And the day continues how Jacob gets terrified. Jacob became very fearful, and he begins to prepare for war because his brother is marching against him. And then the continuing story is how he first splits up his family and his caravans, so that if there's a war, they should each have their own place to protecting them. He begins to strategize. And then the Torah continues in the chapter how he begins to pray to God. And it's interesting the prayer he uses. He says to God, I have been humbled by all the good you've done for me, all the blessings you've given me. And as a result, in a sense, he's trying to invoke God's compassion through his humility, that God help him deal with this protect him from Esav and this war. That's the first thing he does. Second thing, the Torah continues, he sends a new set of messengers with gifts to Esav, his brother, to appease him. So we have here, prepares for war, he prays, and he tries to appease him with some type of gift, flatter him, some type of gesture that perhaps Esav will respond to. And what actually indeed happens, what happens actually is that Esav, when he does see his brother and sees the appeasing gift that he sends, the Torah says his heart does open up, and he actually reconciles. So instead they did not have to end up going to war. The result of Jacob's efforts, Esav and Jacob embrace. So there are two opinions, whether it was a complete embrace, it was a full heart and not full heart, but bottom line, it was an embrace, it was definitely not a war. And finally, Esav says to Jacob, why don't we come and live side by side in peace, since we've made up and we have reconciled. And that's more or less how the story ends, when Jacob says to Esav that the children are young and the sheep are tender. We're not really ready to come. You go ahead, and we'll come slowly. We'll travel, and one day we will meet up again. It's not so relevant to the story that I'm addressing here. I've discussed this in previous years. Essentially, Jacob was basically saying, I'm not ready to live side by side. Right now you've been compassionate. I don't know what will happen if we start living side by side. The children are young, the sheep are tender, we're too vulnerable. And Rashi explains from the Medrash that Jacob was essentially saying, you go ahead, I'll come slowly. Jacob was referring to generations, that it would take time for his children and his grandchildren to have the strength to be able to really live side by side with an Esau, with a warrior, and not feel threatened. So Jacob was essentially talking about the end of days when Mashiach would come, where there it says that that there Jacob and Esau and their descendants will live in peace with each other in a world of peace. And I've discussed this both in writing and in my classes here about how this refers to the Roman Empire and the battles between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it has a lot of so-called historical implications, even to what has been coined the clash of civilizations of our time. But that's not so much the theme here, so I just mentioned it in case you are interested in that and you want to follow up with it. Just go to meaningfullife.com, our website. You could just search, you'll find a lot of pretty comprehensive discussion on this theme. But I want to go back to the confrontation part. I should add one more little piece of a little, not a dramatic little piece of information, is that it wasn't as simple as I just stated. It wasn't like he just sent gifts and Esav and Jacob made up. They did technically. There's another footnote to the story. A little earlier, we all know the story with the wrestling angel. That the night before, after Jacob had split up his family, and did not yet know what's going to happen, whether Esav would actually be appeased by the gifts. So it says that Jacob returns to get the last items as they were traveling, and when he returns, he meets a stranger. That's the way the Torah describes it, a stranger. The Torah doesn't even say who the stranger is. We know from the Zohar and from other commentaries that the stranger was the angel of Esav, like his so-called protecting angel. And there is a battle. So though Esav himself did not battle with Jacob, Esav's angel did. But the Torah continues that they wrestled all night, and the angel saw that he could not prevail. And as the dawn broke, which really meant the time that the angel no longer can fight with Jacob, it says he couldn't hurt him. So what he did was he dislocated his hip joint. That's how the Torah describes it. So Jacob was left with a wound. So though, as I said, Esav and Jacob technically do make up, but it didn't come without a price. The price is that wound. And you have to say that Esav was aware of that as well, because these were evolved people and they knew what was going on in the spiritual realms. The Ramban, Nachmanides, makes a very powerful statement, which this again I've written about, I think last year or 2 years ago. But this whole dislocated hip story, which itself has a lot of mystical and profound meanings. The Ramban writes an interesting thing. He says that displacement, displaced hip, he says in very emotional terms, is every persecution and genocide that the Jews would ever suffer till the end of time is a result of that dislocated hip. So it wasn't just a little momentary wound. It reflects the Holocaust. Obviously, Nachmanides was prior to the Holocaust, but he was living in terrible times, the Middle Ages, the pogroms, the Crusades, which he's referring to. He says that this little dislocated hip, this small wound, reflects all the pains that the Jewish people, basically the descendants of Jacob, would suffer at the hands of the descendants of Esau, who was Rome and the Western Christianity that so persecuted Jews for so many years. Yeah, we live in a different world today, but wasn't that way for close to 1.5 or more, almost 2 millennia. The Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, legally, officially was abolished almost at the end of the 19th century, just to show you how close it was. Obviously, it was not in action during the 19th century mostly, but Spain ultimately closed down the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, I think in 1880 or something like that. I don't know exact date, something like that. Just to show you how close, how close. And then, of course, we know the 20th century. So though the Nazis were not per se religious, but many scholars argue that without Christianity, and I don't just mean Pope Pius, without the climate of anti-Semitism for almost 2 millennia of demonizing the Jews, it would never have been possible to create such a climate that 100 million Germans would just go along with it easily. So, but this is another discussion also for another time. I've written about this. I'm just mentioning it all just to point out to you how this chapter has really quite a lot of historical and cosmic significance. But to go back more to the theme here, the issue of confrontations. So we find that what Jacob did was obviously the wise move. He prepared in every possible way, from one extreme to the next. He prayed, so that's like so-called a religious response. You know? The other extreme, he prepared for war, and he did the middle thing as well. He tried to appease him, which is a form of reaching out. So you learn from this, obviously, that wise people, when it comes to confrontation, make sure they cover all the bases. You don't just try one thing, you make sure everything is lined up, because you never know best case scenario, worst case scenario. So maybe this is the first time you have in a business plan a best and worst case scenario. Jacob, worst case scenario is war, the best case scenario is prayer, and he doesn't have to do anything else. And the middle scenario ended up being that prayer plus his gesture, appeasing gesture, all seemed to have worked. Maybe it also helped that there was the deterrent of war, because I'm sure Esau was not stupid and understood that there's a war in the back as well. So maybe just knowing that also caused them to compromise a bit. So maybe it was all three things that ultimately resulted. As they say in education or in inspiration, it's always better to show the stick instead of using it. You know? Because it has more power when you don't use it. Because if you use it, there's no recourse after that, and that doesn't help. But the threat or the unknown is always better way. So sometimes you have to show that type of strength. But it's more complicated than that, because it all comes down to, ultimately, as I said before, the situation that we're in. So I want to address that more in depth, and how you can actually identify a personality in how they deal with confrontation. You know, sometimes we know how to put on an act of being stronger than we really are. Sometimes the other way around, we put on an act that weaker than we really are. Sometimes it's both. But when it comes to a confrontation and how we deal with it, you learn a lot about people. Well, I'm sure you've had experiences like this, where you're part of a team, or part of a group, and you plan accordingly, and everybody's united in a certain objective and goal. And then the first crisis sets in. So what do you learn? You learn about everybody very quickly. Suddenly, when there was no crisis, everybody was allies, and everything was so nice. Suddenly it becomes the first argument, because how do you deal with the crisis? So of course there's the finger pointing game, where people start blaming you. You're the fault of the crisis. You're the fault of the crisis. If you had not done this, you're not done that. What's really going on, obviously, is not just who's at fault, it's also how people deal with confrontation. And you'll see some people will absolutely compromise all the standards, everything we agreed to, even in writing and so on. Other people will start pulling out because they can't deal with the confrontation. Others, as I mentioned before, will join the fray and thrive on it. And then there are others that just are wishy-washy and they are ambiguous and they go back and forth from one to the next. And you can't always even know which is the right way to go. Because to say that every confrontation one has to confront and fight is obviously not correct. Like even here, had, for instance, Jacob shot the first bullet, or there were no bullets then, or whatever, it's just the first weapon, because of the fear that Esau was marching. Esau was marching with 400 aggressive soldiers. Had he done that, there would have been a different result. So he prepared for it, but he tried one final thing. So to say that every time there's a crisis or confrontation you have to take it on, it may sound very courageous, but not necessarily always very wise. So the wisdom, of course, is to look at every option and to be able to assess what should be done, and so to speak, do it in a paced way, in a paced fashion, so you don't go all the way to war immediately. You reserve that if there absolutely is no choice. But then why is there so much conflict in the world if people can't just use reason? I mean, many people read the Bible, they read Jacob's story, but even if not read Jacob's story, this doesn't require rocket science to know that there's a confrontation. Why not just do that in a positive way? Why don't people attempt other attempts, and people go to war easily, some easier than others? And of course, above all, this question applies to relationships. How many relationships in crisis use these methods? Why is it that relationships so fall apart? Not because all the methods have been tried. The ultimate real reason that we don't use our reason, frankly, to solve problems and deal with confrontation is because you lose your reason when you get emotional. As soon as there's fear, you do not start thinking straight. It's easy to sit here and talk about this in a theoretical way, and everyone, of course, makes sense. First thing you do, you send scouts to find out what's going on. That doesn't work. You start preparing. You don't like it, you prepare for war. You separate your family. You make sure strategically you're in the best position. Then you pray. And try to have God intervene, or at least give you the strength to deal with it, and maybe some miracle. And then you appease. It's a very simple procedure. How many people you really know do this when they're dealing with confrontation? So what's going on? Why can't we have that simple lesson? The answer, as I just said, is because once confrontation comes, what happens? The first thing it does is it drives fear in our hearts. Even here, the Torah readily acknowledges. It doesn't say Jacob was, this is the interesting thing about the Torah. It doesn't talk always positively even about its own heroes. It says he was terrified, basically. It says, Vayira Yaakov Moed. If you're just wondering, it doesn't just say he's afraid. It says he's very afraid, very frightened. Moed in Hebrew is very. So the Torah puts Jacob. You could say, why was he so frightened? God was blessed until now. Where's his trust in God, his faith? Because the Torah wants to acknowledge and tell us it's important to know that people get afraid. As I said, use this as our story. People get afraid, even in Jacob, when there's a confrontation. That's a natural thing, because it's an unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. Will you be attacked? Will you be hurt? There's a family to protect. Yeah. Then, of course, he got sober and figured out we got to do something about it. He didn't let his fears consume him. So there you go, right there is a lesson. So had the Torah not said that he was afraid, you say, okay, Jacob is Jacob, he's unique. He's able to stand in the face of an enemy and not blink and then prepare. But the Torah does not say. It says he absolutely was afraid. So it's very clear that fear and takes over, and once fear takes over, the mind goes. That's the bottom line. It's like no different than any other bias, maybe even worse than other biases. The Torah says, "Sheichid ya'aver einei chachamim." Bias, self-interest, blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the tongue of the righteous. Even though they're wise, the wisest person, buy him off, or he has some interest in the result, can no longer be objective. Period. There was no more objective person in history than Moses. the humble man stood before God, and nothing could buy him. Yet when it came to pass judgment on his own family, brother or sister, he recused himself, which of course is part of his truthfulness, because even though he wasn't aware of it, he said to himself, it's impossible, they're my brother and sister. Somewhere I will be biased. And here's a person who was accountable and looked at himself, and even no one asked him to recuse himself. He recused himself, period. He would have been completely trusted. But somewhere in his unconscious, he knew that's the nature of the beast. We are biased when it comes to family. Some people are biased for the positive, some for the negative, but we're all biased. That's the bottom. So Moses chose to recuse himself. So when it comes to fear, rest assured it's even more than just bias, because there, fear takes a whole different picture inside of us. Because it's very hard to assess how fearful person are you? How insecure are you? One of the hardest questions to answer. First of all, most people don't even acknowledge they're insecure. It takes a lot of years of therapy or a lot of pain to even come to that point. It's a very vulnerable and difficult statement to make that I'm insecure. Because even to acknowledge it to yourself and to acknowledge to what extent it is not a simple thing. So when some confrontation comes your way, what's happening really, if you want to know the complex dynamic that's going on, is suddenly you're exposed to a situation that you weren't prepared for. You're not in control because there's another force at work now, potential opponent, and you don't know what that person's going to do. So all your fears start working overtime, and it starts really, so who you truly are is going to be exposed there. And being that you don't necessarily want to acknowledge or have acknowledged or are self-aware of all your own fears and phobias and insecurities, obviously it's going to be very complicated, because how secure are you really? Remember, the more secure you really are, the better you're going to be able to deal with it. Number one is the fear won't completely consume you. It won't shape everything in your strategy. And number two, you'll just be able to gather yourself. I mean, I've been in situations where I was asked to consult people who had this, they had a potential conflict in business, let's say, whether it was a takeover or dealing with a breakaway entity. How do you do with it? And the first issue, which of course an objective person, being that I was not involved, that's why you go to a consultant, because that person doesn't have the fear, is you see right away in front of your eyes how when you ask the people, so what would you do? You right away see that the driving engine here is fear. And fear always exaggerates situations. So here, Jacob he's marching with 400 soldiers. What does that mean? It immediately means it's war. It's called declaration of war. But you see, Jacob could have, as I said, become so committed to that he would have declared war as well, and he didn't. He prepared for it. This requires a presence. Now, usually people with experience can do that. People who are first time under the gun do not know how to deal with confrontation. I mean, they say this even, I don't want to even use this example, it's somewhat maybe even frivolous, this example of see people who have experience in the Super Bowl or in the World Series, that the fact that you were once under that pressure and you played in that situation gives you the ability. Sometimes you watch a tennis match, and you're just watching it can make you can drive crazy. Your nerves are at edge, and you're a nail-biting situation, and you wonder how could they even serve and have composure. And it's not because they're superhumans, it's because there's a certain training. And after a while, when a soldier trained enough, the first time there's a shot, experience gives you the confidence to be able to handle it. But that can only come with experience. So obviously someone in a situation who's had confrontation and has come through it has a lot of wisdom to bring and a lot of advice to bring to people who have never been there. And it's not just seichel and wisdom, it's a lot of experience. Experience knowing psychology, knowing the worst situation, but also knowing the best situation. Because we all know, as I said before, the power of a deterrent. Just the mere fact that Esau also knew that Jacob had an army was not a small factor. So that factor that he let him know that he has that army, plus the appeasement, was the secret between winning or losing. Had he not done it somewhat different, a little different twist, and it wouldn't have worked. So the first thing that we have to acknowledge is this, like this verse, Vayir Yaakov Mod, the fear element, which really means the power of emotions in our lives. Which, on one hand, emotions are a great tool. We all want to be people who are in the moment, or present, as they say, emotionally experiencing something. We live in a world where a lot of people are called out-of-body experiences, where their head is detached from their emotions, and don't allow their emotions to fully express themselves for whatever reason. That's also, by the way, through fear. But I could just speak for myself. I remember, as a younger man, I thought that intellect was a very powerful force, and as I grow older, I feel it's quite overrated. I know you may find this a little odd, but yes, that's what happened. And I can tell you, I remember a few epiphanies, so to speak, a few experiences that drove the point home to me. I remember early on in my so-called career, so I was teaching this class in Brooklyn in my home. It was a smaller group, as I mentioned last week, the whole evolution of it. And one evening, a fellow came to the class, and he brought along, I guess, a date. And they were sitting at the table. There was maybe 7, 8 people at the table. And I saw that the woman, the date he brought along, was not very happy to be there, to put it mildly. And of course, she took it out on me somewhat. Not that I had brought her there. And not that later I found out that she didn't even know she was coming there. He said, I'm going to take you to a great place. So teacher, she's going to some show or some restaurant or some, I don't know what. He brought it to me. So and she was not exactly, as I said, ready for this. What she would call this ultra-Orthodox rabbi sitting there. So she was, you could see she was fuming, basically. Later I gave it to him over his head, obviously. I said, well, you don't do such a thing. He said she would never have come if I asked her. So that to me was not exactly a good excuse. That's exactly the problem. She wouldn't come because it's not enough manipulation. But in a strange way, you'll see from the story, I would never ever advise him or anyone to do that, but in retrospect, something interesting happened out of this, and you'll see in a moment. So she was there, and then, the table was open to questions, and it was more of a more intimate group, so a lot of back and forth. And she started giving to me. I saw she was very knowledgeable, especially about Judaism. And she started giving me the whole list of how women are second-class citizens. And she had it all the halachas, all the Jewish laws about this, about witnesses, and about the blessings and the aliyahs and the rabbis. She had the whole thing, which fine with me. I don't flinch because somebody has questions or controversial questions. But I saw it was also coming from a lot of anger. It wasn't just academic questions. I said, yeah, I can ask any question. That was the tone. So tell me this, and then tell me this. So I was younger, but I was not stupid enough to engage with her in this battle. So I did not choose to go to war. Let's put it that way. And I also didn't choose appeasement. I think I should have prayed, but I didn't do that either. I chose a different tactic completely. It's called retreat. So I said to her, I know you're not going to like what I'm going to say to you right now. You're going to see it as evasive and so on, but I have to take the risk because I respect you enough that I think that you would maybe appreciate. I said, your questions are very good questions, excellent questions. They're legitimate. However, to give you a full answer, to do justice with a good answer is going to take more than just an evening. It's going to take quite a few introductions and a few elaborate discussions. So, my suggestion is you keep coming to this class and we'll deal with it in time. So did she let me have it? She says, yeah, I heard that already from 1,000 rabbis. You all say the same thing, and then I come, nothing happens. You never address it anyway. So I said, look, I knew you were going to answer, but I will tell you this. I will stand by my guns. I am not going to start giving you a cute answer, because it's not a cute question. It's a serious question. And I'll give you a good answer. You'll give me another question, answer question. We'll not get anywhere. And that's it. I stand by that. You do what you wish. I would not back down. And I thought to myself, listen, I knew I wasn't being evasive. That was the truth. I knew it was just not going to work. Not because she was upset And that would be the worst if I said, an angry woman you are. That would not work, in fact. That would come down very sexist. So it's not what I was thinking even, but I knew it was not, first of all, it was not the environment for it. I sensed there was a lot of anger, and then I found out she was brought there against her will, so you can imagine it's not exactly good timing to engage in some type of discussion that is so emotionally charged. So, anyway, that was what I said. I had no clue what was going to happen. Later I found out what happened. I gave it to this guy over his head. I said, how many other dates do you do things like this to? Maybe not with my class, maybe with other situations. Yeah, well, he's got his relationship problems. We won't get there. That's another story. So, and lo and behold, she appears next week without him. No, they remained friends. It wasn't like. Look, I guess he had a sense. It wasn't that. It was just unexpected to her. It was like he was surprising her. It was a little not respectful just to simply tell her. But he did what he did. Fine, I'm not going to get into that. So, she came back, and she was still argued a lot, and it was very engaging and all of that. But she came back, to her credit, week after week, for months. She did. I can't tell you why, but that she did. And for years, it ultimately happened. Around 8 months later, and here's, like I said, the first story I heard, where I saw that my instincts were right, but I didn't know to what extent. Excuse me. To think. Yeah? Okay, maybe. Okay, fine. And now's the people here that are missing. Look, they all ran to the cookie jar. Okay, so part 2. So what happened? Here's what happened. Around 8 months later, is that where I left off? Yeah. 8 months later, this woman calls me up, or maybe after the class, I don't remember. She says she wants to see me privately. So I said to come to my office. So she came and met me in the office. And she opens up her heart, her soul, I guess. And she says, this is completely without I didn't ask anything. She said to me, you probably realize I'm quite angry. I said, well, now that you mention it. And I want to tell you why. I want to tell you it's not directed to you. She remembered vividly the first time she came to the class. She mentioned the details. She says, I'm not going to go into the graphic details for obvious reasons. But she said basically I was sexually abused. And the one who did the most abuse was my religious uncle, Jewish religious uncle, who was the one that put on tefillin and kosher, and he would come in, my grandmother and everybody would worship him. He's like the tzaddik. And he was very abusive to me on a consistent basis. So you can imagine I'm very angry at men in general, especially at religious. So my first reaction, or knee-jerk reaction, as soon as I came in, the fact that he brought me in against my will didn't help, that he brought me against my will, was, I took it out, and I want to apologize because it has absolutely nothing to do with you. And I'm aware enough of that. And my questions, too, came from a place of anger. These were questions that, wasn't just theoretical questions about women's role. Because I saw where I grew up, and it wasn't a traditional home, but we had my uncle and others. And it was the whole thing, besides the abuse, was a very unhealthy attitude to women and men, the whole thing. I see religion as just an abusive force. And that's where I'm coming from. And it was very wise of you, this is her words, that you didn't answer, because I would not have accepted any answer. I may not have acknowledged it then, but it wasn't about an answer. I was completely broken from it, and it was not like you're going to give me some good answer and I say, oh, well, now I understand why my uncle abused me. I mean, that's not going to happen. Or why... but now that months have passed, and you did give all the introductions, now I want to call you on what you promised. You said you would explain it, and I do want to know. And I think this is all her speaking. I think I'm now at a place where I could hear it. And it's not like I'm healed from all my challenges, but I do want to know what you have to say. So we had a long conversation about it, and I shared with her different ideas. And I know you probably want to know what I said. I will share it to maybe another class, because it's really a whole class on its own, or more than one even. But suffice it to say that from then on, anytime any woman, or any man for that matter, asked these questions, I would just turn to her and say, why don't you take it away? So firstly, she had much more credibility than me. When a man tries to explain why women are not second class, that itself can be part of the male conspiracy. I also have an explanation. So coming from a woman, it's a different story. And also, her history, she was hurt. And so it's not like she's just giving some type of by book answer. It was a real personal answer. But what I learned there was, my instincts were right. I didn't know the extent of it. I didn't imagine. But I learned from that the profound impact of experiences in our lives that completely change our perception of things. Without experience, anyone would say, okay, she's asking questions. Answer them. And here the opposite would have happened. If I had answered the questions, what she had asked, it would have been the opposite effect. It would have been like, like you really have the gall and the chutzpah even to try to answer type of thing. I'm just trying to point out how here was, I guess, a potential confrontation. It's more subtle. It's not a war in the sense of life and death. But these confrontations, too, have profound impact on our lives. Because how you deal with them. And I saw that her own fears, and as she acknowledged, and her own experiences completely shaped how she reacts to things. So, firstly, sometimes when someone thinks you're the enemy, you personalize it. And it may not be you. It may be that the enemy is an experience they've had that they're projecting on you. So right there is that whole different perception. How do you deal with a confrontation like that? That's a whole different story than if you know that a person means you. I was just recently counseling a couple, and this is exactly what happened. The woman started describing the situation and became a personal attack on her husband. And I knew exactly how he was going to react. And he reacted, obviously, very, very hurt, very angry, like you're invalidating everything about me. And the truth is, she didn't mean to personally attack him. She didn't even want to do it. But she was trying to gasp for air that she didn't have for so long, that it came out, that she attacks everything. You start attacking, it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater when you're angry. And that's a normal reaction. So I tried to explain it. But my point is that so often our reactions to confrontations are not always about a very objective perspective on the confrontation. What fear does, or it's not only necessarily fear, the emotions involved in a confrontation, what they do is they distort your whole picture. So the first thing you must have is a clarity. What is really happening here? Is this an attack on you? Is it an attack in general? Is the whole thing a misunderstanding? How many wars have been fought and you found out that it was never meant to be? What you heard about, that someone said about you, was not even true. Or even if it was a complete misunderstanding. It's sometimes the opposite. We sometimes like to believe it's a misunderstanding and it wasn't. But very often there are things like that happen. I personally know of incidents where brothers that don't speak to each other, all based on someone that manipulated both of them and turned them against them, was in a third party's interest to have them not speak to each other. Can you imagine? And this happens, unfortunately. more than it should. So this itself, just determining what are the forces at work, understanding that we're not just dealing with someone attacking or an opponent, you're also dealing with emotions, and the emotions are much more complicated. I would even say the emotions are maybe even more of our enemy than the enemy itself. The fear, the distortions that it creates, the paranoia. And if you are insecure and have been hurt, you're obviously going to be much more vigilant, and that extra vigilance could end up becoming detrimental. A person who's been hurt is going to put up much more defenses than a person that's not been. And you could say for good reason, because you don't want to get hurt. But on the other hand, it also can create a wall, an impenetrable wall, that way you end up the situation gets even more complicated. Obviously, the wisest approach to everything is always objectivity, in the sense getting objective perspective. What is there to lose? And remember, of course, I'm talking about not a dangerous situation at the moment. Obviously, if you smell fire, God forbid, you don't start calling consultants to know whether it's fire. You just get out of the building, even if it's doubt. I'm not talking about being in a line of fire or some type of immediate danger. There, you just have to follow your instincts, and hopefully they're healthy instincts, and you just do what you got to do. But in most situations, there is an opportunity to reflect, and what's there to lose to hear an objective perspective, like telling somebody, here's what's going on, well, what do you think? And it's not, you have to obviously find a person who has the strength to know when to confront, and the strength to know when not to confront. Because frankly, you need strength in both situations. So the first thing is just is distinguishing thing, let's say, between the smoke and the fire, or what do they call it, the sizzle and the steak, and the emotions that are around a confrontational situation and the situation itself. They're not necessarily the same, and there's something very hard to distinguish. Your reaction to it can be much worse than what it really is, and regardless, your reaction to it definitely can help shape a response that may not be the best response. That's the most important thing. Really, you could say, I know there's some attorneys in the room here. Maybe a good attorney is really one of the first people, attorney that's not just invested in making money off of you, but is interested in trying to diffuse a situation or in your interest. A good attorney who has experience, who's seen wars, knows how to fight. But the best attorneys are the ones that know how to fight and tell you, stay away from a fight, or here are the ways to stay away. There's ways to diffuse, and so on. I remember my father telling me years ago, my father was a master in the world. He was a media person, he was a journalist. He was excellent at he knew human nature very well, and he understood how wars begin. I remember he told me a thing. He says, one rule you have to always know, that if you're about to make an announcement, or say something publicly, or something, news is going to get out of the decision you made, that somewhere is affecting somebody who may see it as a threat or so on, you must make a phone call to that person. You yourself have to tell that person. Do not let them hear it from a third party. Because if they hear it from a third party, you'll never be forgiven. Because as soon as you, sitting, let's say, in this, and someone calls you and said, did you hear what this and this guy did? That's it. A switch goes on inside of you that it becomes almost impossible to forgive, because it's like, not just the person did it, but it's like behind my back, and I hear it from the street, and then you can't just call up and say, oh, I apologize, I should have called you before you heard about it. It's common knowledge of anyone that is in the art of negotiation, but it's something that very few of us like to do, because you don't want to call that person. You'd rather I don't want to deal with that, even the tension of the call. But a thing like that can diffuse so many situations, because it's like almost telling the person up front. It just usually evokes in a person the pride, doesn't let them become so angry. Because they were told, and then they can absorb it. So you give them a day to absorb before you announce it, so to speak. This is a small example of how our emotions can get in the way, and sometimes, if with the good advice, you can do something that just preempts a situation. So when you look at this whole episode here, confrontation, I said the first thing is this emotional thing that affects us. I wanted to tell another story which is similar, but to some other extent, that taught me that it's not about the mind, it's not about telling people. Look, when you tell a child, for example, comes running to his parents and says, I'm scared to go into the room, or it's dark, I think there's a monster in the closet or something. So it's not going to help exactly if you tell your child, something, there's no monster in the closet, there's no such thing as monsters. Grow up, The only way that the child's not going to be afraid is if you hold them, show them that you love them, give them the security, and maybe at some point, when they're not terrified, open the closet and shine a light, and they see. I have an uncle who was unfortunately killed in a car accident 15 years ago. So he was a little kid. He woke up in the middle of the night, and there was a thunderstorm. He started, he got really scared. So he ran to his mother's bed, my grandmother. And what are you scared of? He says, I'm scared of the thunderstorm. So she said, you have to be scared of anything except God. Okay, he goes back to sleep, and thunderstorms are thunderstorms, and another thunderstorm a half hour later. So he comes running to his mother, and she says, I told you. He says, what are you scared of? He says, I'm scared of God. So God works through a thunderstorm, So the point is that we all have fears that are irrational, basically. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what the nature of fear is. It creates a whole different distortion and so on. But the question is whether you make decisions based on it. Not that we have it, that is fine. As I said, Torah acknowledges Jacob had it. Later we're going to read about Moses, who also had fear when God says to him, go to Boyal Pare, come to Pharaoh. He says, come with me to Pharaoh. And the Zohar asks, why does it say come with me to Pharaoh? Why doesn't it say go to Pharaoh? Everywhere else it says, Lech, go. And here suddenly, Boyal Pare, to come with me to Pharaoh. So the Zohar says, because when God told him this time to go to Pharaoh, he sensed that God wanted him to confront him head on. It wasn't no longer negotiations. It wasn't no longer, appeasing, making deals. It was, tell him now, I want the people to release them. And he knew that Pharaoh was not an easy guy, and he was complicated, also a spiritually complex person, and powerful one. So the Zohar says that he was terrified. Moses was afraid to go. That's why God preempted it by saying, come with me. Instead of telling him go, which means like you go on your own, come, which means I'm coming with you. And the Zohar elaborates what that means. And of course that gave Moses the strength, the confidence to do it. So we're talking about the greatest people in history who had fears. So it's not something to be ashamed of. And the key thing is to understand that it affects how you think. So I remember another episode, another incident, I guess, that was also at this class. That was later in Manhattan. We were on, where was it? 82nd Street. We did different journeys, not 42 like they did in the wilderness, but quite a few journeys. So I remember I was talking about unconditional love in the class. Conditional love meaning a love that is based on something you're getting for it, ulterior motive. So of course, if your needs are not being met, or the motive is not being met, then the love is also affected in direct proportion. Whereas unconditional love is unconditional, it's not based on anything, any conditions or any motives or so on. So as I was elaborating on this, I remember to the right of me was sitting a fellow, and he began to mumble. And his mumbling started getting louder, to the point where he literally was almost frothing, foaming at the mouth. And he started talking, and he started talking so loud that everybody heard him. So I stopped speaking. He started saying, unconditional. He got so emotional about it. He said, unconditional love. The only unconditional love you can trust is the love of a dog. So first some people thought he was making a joke, but they saw he got really serious. The love of a dog. You come home, no matter what your day was like, no matter how your boss treated you, no matter what mood you're in, the dog just jumps all over you and licks you unconditionally. That's the only unconditional love. You never can trust the love of human beings. This was this tone. It was even angrier than that. And he was carrying on. And there was a class, a pretty full room, and everybody was didn't know what's going on here. So some woman yells at him from the other side. She says, can you shut up already? We came here to hear Rabbi Jacobson. I remember what he said. So I remember he looked at her with these eyes your eyes turned into slits, what's the word, squinted. Huh? And he looked at her like this. He says, you're so shallow. That was his response, which was an interesting response. I remember thinking, but then everybody was looking at me, what am I going to do here? So the truth is, you'll hear in a moment what happened. So I just said, to diffuse the whole thing, I said, tonight we're talking about human love. Canine love we'll discuss in another class. So he said, okay, I understand. He completely changed his whole thing, because I didn't invalidate it. I just essentially said, that's not the theme of this evening. And that was it. But here's what happened. At the end of the evening, a woman came over to me, gave me a note. which and I put it in my pocket. And when I came home, I read what she wrote to me. This is the words she wrote to me. I remember it very vividly. She wrote, "I'm coming to your class for 3 years already, something like that, 2-3 years, and I've learned many things. But tonight I learned more than anything how you treated him with dignity. Biggest lesson I learned tonight." I shouldn't explain why. That was what she wrote, which of course was very touching to me. It was a compliment, but I'm not sharing it to toot my horn. I'm sharing it for the point. And it was it was easy to use him as a parody. I could have made fun of him, or even a sophisticated joke that he wouldn't have even picked up, maybe. But that was obviously not who I am. I'm not doing that. Even though it was like he was. I mean, I would say it definitely was not a problem. What's he talking about? I don't even know. But I will say, however, that I remember when I was much, much younger, and early years when I first learned about real abuse. Thank God I grew up in a relatively functional home. I say relatively because everything's relative, right? As they say about the 5 Jews, what do they say? That the 5 Jews, Moses taught that everything is the law, and Jesus taught that everything is love, and Marx taught that everything is money, and Freud taught that everything is sex, and Einstein taught that everything is relative. So relatively speaking, I grew up in a healthier environment, and as a result, honestly, I was naive, very naive. It's hard to imagine when you have not been around something and you've never seen it, and you're not yourself really in that place, to understand certain types of abuse. It's just unfathomable. It's still unfathomable to me, but now I know it's a reality and I know they can't deny it. So I remember a guy came to me, and I was in my mid-20s, young guy, very green about many things. And I was already giving the class, this informal class in my home, and people would come to my office then. And the guy came to me, and he said to me, and he was like twice my age. So I was firstly even uncomfortable. He's coming to me. One thing, I'll teach him some Torah, but he's talking to me about things that were out of my league, so to speak. But he felt, I guess he trusted me, so he spoke to me, and he said to me, he said exactly the same words. He said to me, "I want to tell you that I learned love from a dog." Remember, that's exactly what he said to me. I thought, I didn't know what he's talking about. I thought this is like, I don't know what he meant. And then he said to me, I had a father who was alcoholic, and he would beat us when he'd come home. He beat my mother, and I was the oldest, so often I would go make sure he hits me, not my mother. I would offer myself. And with a chain, and again, I don't want to go into details, but he said sometimes I was such pain, and so bruised, I would go outside to sleep in the garden, near the kennel. I guess they lived, I don't know where they lived, and the dog would spend the night with me. Basically just, there. And I learned love. That's where I learned love. It was the only love I learned about that was unconditional. Now, when this guy said it, I didn't necessarily remember that particular story, but I never forgot that story either. And I said, you never know, people can say things that are completely, you may think are completely off the wall. And, I'm speaking in class and suddenly he's carrying on about canine love or whatever. That's unconditional. And I'm not saying that he should have had an outburst or not. That's not my business to judge. But you learn from these things that what's going on in people's lives are much more complicated than meets the eye. That's why I say, I know I'm talking about extreme stories, and you could say, hey, what's relevant to us here? Hopefully nobody has anything close to this type of level. But I know from my experience that, firstly, that may not be true. And secondly, even if it's not in this extreme, we all have maybe a little subtler, but the forces that have shaped us are so profound that they do all kinds of crazy things that when you're dealing with a confrontation. And that's why we're very, very unreliable and probably very difficult for us to really know how to deal with a confrontation. And I'm not talking about a simple one. Simple one, obviously, if you can diffuse it, you can negotiate. I'm talking about when it gets complicated. We're wars that go on forever. It could be familial wars within battles of family. Now's the holiday season. I know people who are terrified of the holiday season. They don't want to even go see their families. All the confrontations involved. And then we learn how to fake it and smile. That's that approach. And then you become a little older and you start saying, is that right? Maybe that's not right. Maybe I should confront it. All the conflict, that's on a personal level. And then there's all the other stuff. So this chapter is not just is extremely, I would say, indispensable one, because it just puts into context. Even though, as I said, the advice is very simple. What does he do? Prepared for war, he prayed, and he appeased them. But it's not that simple when you have to actually apply it. It doesn't work that way when you get emotionally enmeshed in it. It's not at all that way. So what you learn from this, as I said, number one is all the forces that it brings out of you. And you usually gravitate to all kinds of not necessarily healthy tools, to ways that your parents solve problems, which is not necessarily the best way, or not solve problems. And that will become a much bigger problem than the actual confrontation. See, Jacob was healthy. He was afraid. He was terrified, actually. But he sat himself down and said, listen, I'm going to have to deal with this. I'm not retreating. I'm not going back to where I came from. I'm going to Israel, and I'm going to stay there. And what do? And so he sat down and figured it out. The first thing, I got to protect my family. So he split them up, made sure that there be the minimum risk to any group. He prepared for war, because that has to be prepared for, even though I'm sure nobody wants to go there. And then the next thing is he prayed, which is interesting, other extreme. Usually a person preparing for war doesn't pray. You're in that mode, you better, you don't really have the presence of mind to suddenly pray. And it's interesting, even his prayer is quite powerful. In this humble tone, he says, when you prepare for war, you have to be aggressive. And you have to be ready to fight anything. And it's a whole mindset. And suddenly the same man, literally the same sentence, the same breath, speaks to God, I've been humbled by all your greatness, by all your chesed, by all the kindness you've done to me. Which is an enormous statement of strength, that he was a person who was able to transcend his fear. I don't think he had a consultant. There's no attorneys here, so I don't think that's part of the story. But he was able to consult himself, I guess. He was able to go back into his soul and think it through and say to himself, now, there's on one hand, I fight the war if I have to. On the other hand, I pray with humility. And then I appease. Completely three different mindsets. It's almost like three different people. You'd think the aggressive one goes to war. The so-called the timid one prays. And the appeaser is in general one of these hackers that knows how to, maneuver. Usually you have three different companies that do that for you. You don't have one company that does all three. But you see, the key thing here with Jacob, which is the lesson to all of us, above all, is he had bittul. It was not about him. See, the fear was about him. The emotions are about us. That's why they cloud our ability to make decisions. But once you get beyond that and you say, it's not about me, it's not personal, I need to know what's right to do here, and I want to get to the right determination, then things change. You see, the strength to go to war comes from the same place as the strength not to go to war, if it's the right thing to do. Because it's you making the decision. Very often you'll find, we need to find now a warrior for this situation. That's not necessarily the solution. And, sometimes you need to do it because the other side are fighting a war. But if you, for yourself, to really have the sanity to deal with confrontation, it ultimately comes down to that you are not the confrontation. As soon as you become too enmeshed, and you become the warrior, so to speak, instead of just going to war, because that's what needs to be done, that's where all the problems begin. And it's an extension of the fear, frankly. It's an extension of your investment in it. You become so involved in it that it's all about you. Only a person who's able to somewhat separate and say, I have a deeper mission in life. My mission is not just to win this battle. There's bigger things at stake. And then you have to determine, with those bigger things at stake, is it important enough to go to war for? Or is it not important enough? It's a whole different way of thinking about it. Again, I'm not suggesting that that's a reason to retreat. There are many times, you find in the Torah, Moses went to war and sometimes he didn't. Jacob was prepared for war and sometimes he didn't. It's not like a rule, because it's coming from strength. You see, a lot of people are afraid to take this approach because, it's a way of me becoming weak. Any excuse I can have to get out of this situation. I have a good family, I have other businesses, why do I have to fight this? That's not what I'm saying. It's saying that you're looking at it with an eye that is driven by humility rather than vindictiveness and rather than vengeance or even tit for tat. How often someone challenges you and what's really happening is it's your pride. You can't back off of a challenge. You can't show that, hey, I could be challenged. It's a certain macho-ness that's not necessarily good for the cause. Sometimes it is good. I'm not suggesting that, but what makes the decision, ultimately, the big question that has to be asked, and that requires deep objectivity, and that's what Jacob ultimately had was, I am terrified, I'm emotionally distorted by that, but I have a cause here. I need to know what is my cause. He could have retreated back to where he came from, but he knew that's not an option. He's going to Israel, it's the promised land, it's where his parents lived, it's where God promised. So he knew he's going to Israel. It was not an option for him not to go to Israel because Esav is there. He could have said, Esav has a war, I'll stay back, I'll go back to Haran for another 20 years, and I'll come back in 20 years. Maybe Esav will die or something. He didn't do that, so he knew that his mission is that. Now the question is, how do I do it best? Is war the way to go? Is appeasement the way? Is prayer? Is it all of it? And so on. So it's like really setting your sights to a place that is not about the immediate battle, it's about the bigger objective. If the bigger objective has to be reached, and this is the way to go, and there's no way around it, then you got to figure out what's the best way to go about it. So you're basically, really, what you're doing is taking yourself out of the intense emotions of it, and really coming down to becoming a much more strategic person. I always wonder, I think when that's what they say anyway, that FDR said when they attacked Pearl Harbor. I think it's in his biography or one of the books I read, I don't remember where. So of course it was like a serious humiliation besides the attack and the deaths and so on. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, that brazen chutzpah. So you can imagine, just nationalistic pride required some type of reaction. So, they had some type of token reaction. They bombed part of Tokyo. Not that it had necessarily significance, but it was a psychological thing you sometimes do to just infuse confidence into the army. So when they were starting to make the plans, how are you going to suddenly bomb? I think a third of the Navy was destroyed at Pearl Harbor or more, and it wasn't like they were prepared to go to war against Japan, even though America was mighty, but they weren't mobilized. It was a surprise. And so they found some cockamamie thing, a way to attack Tokyo. But when they were thinking of the plans, they were looking, they needed someone with a lot of guts to do this, because it wasn't like so rational. It was just to show Japan that we are not going to back down. So the person who came up with the plan was a submarinist. A guy here who is I call a submarine a person who is like the captain of a submarine. Now, captains of submarines have particular training, because remember, a submarine, you don't have the luxury that you do above water. We have more time to make a decision and stuff like that. Submarine, you don't split a decision, you don't make a decision. It's life and death, because you're underwater and anything can happen when you're being attacked, etc. So it's a particular set of nerves that you require. So FDR reportedly asked who came up with this plan. So they told him a submarinist. So he said, I like submariners because they have no time for BS, and neither do I. Which really is, in a sense, you think about commanders-in-chief in war. I know we all have negative images about war, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. We're not looking to go to war. But you think people who have that commander-in-chief, they hear a report from the front, a terrible report, that their soldiers were massacred, that a battalion was destroyed. And, the commander-in-chief, all he can do is build upon the data he's getting. He's getting such a report. How does he make a decision? Do you retreat or do you go forward? Now, if you ask the soldier in the front, you can't rely on the soldier's opinion, because the soldier is under fire, and for all the soldier knows they're all going to be destroyed. So you have a person who's playing with other people's lives, so to speak, but he was a man that was on the front once. We're not talking about no commander-in-chief did not fight. And there's just experience of having seen death in its eye, knowing the instincts and wisdom that he has to make a decision that can affect millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people. These are enormous places where human beings rise to the occasion. Sometimes mistakes are made, but you think what kind of pressure a person has to be under to decide split-second decisions like these, life and death. People still debate whether Truman was right to drop the two atom bombs in Japan. And I'm sure if there was CNN and all the pundits at the time, it probably would not have been dropped, because they'd be still arguing about it. This way it could have been done, blackout, nobody knew nothing, next thing you know, the bombs were dropped. But the debate rages. Why? Because on one hand, with one decision, killed hundreds of thousands of people and maimed millions forever. I'm not making a case against it. On the other, what his generals told him is very simple: the Japanese will not surrender. They will be an agonizing death. I'm bleeding, and many more than hundreds of thousands will die, not one day, over the next period of time. You know, and Truman was a haberdasher from Missouri. He wasn't like a trained soldier or anything like that. I'm not taking anything away from him. You know, he was elected really, time of war. FDR actually wasn't elected. He took over the position. I mean, he was elected in the next election, but I mean, during the war, he just took over. He was chosen by the president, not an elected official. And he made this decision. You know, I can't imagine how he made this decision, but he had to make it. And I guess he weighed the two things. And no one would have expected that he ever was the person that's going to be the competent one to make the decision. But sometimes the position you're in, you have to rise to the occasion. And I'm not even debating it. It happened, and maybe it was the wise thing, and it was the worst of two evils, basically. No one suggests dropping the atom bomb was a great thing to do. But the bottom line is, it wasn't the communists, as liberals like to remind us. It wasn't anyone else. It was the United States government that dropped the atom bomb. They're the only ones that ever used the atom bomb, with all the nuclear threats and stuff like that. Ahmadinejad always likes to remind America of that. I'm not talking about his agenda, but you get the idea. My point that I'm trying to make is that there are situations where, when you're under fire and you're in a confrontation, I'm bringing it back to us personally, there are so many emotions that get involved that it's almost impossible to really make normal decisions. Which is why it's so vital to learn from Jacob. And I would say even people in those positions that make these decisions, ultimately, whether it was Truman or these commanders-in-chief or the submarinist or anyone, what they have, I'm talking about if they're doing the right thing, they're competent. What they ultimately have is the ability to step away from the fear and from the immediate emotions and try to look what is right for the cause. It really comes down to that. The only way I could see a person making such a major decision and taking the responsibility forever to be the person who will always be blamed or the hero for a decision like that. I guess I can only say with Truman, it must have been, we say that God chooses leaders in a way and maybe gives them strength even though they may not have it before. Once they're in that position and there's life in their hands. Not that they can't make mistakes, and as I said, competence is a factor here. You can be a very incompetent leader, but you could also suddenly rise to the occasion. And it has happened in history that people who you would never have expected they could rise, put in a certain situation, they're able to make a decision, they don't get frozen. And I would say that the lesson from Jacob to make the right decision under that is only way is to look at the truth of the cause. It's not about how angry I got at Pearl Harbor or how angry I got at somebody who attacked me. That cannot be the basis of the decision. Because that can create distortions of how you react. Sometimes reacting tit for tat creates much worse problem. And sometimes reacting immediately tit for tat is the best thing to do. So how do you determine? You determine based on what is the cause that you're driving at, not based on what happened, not based on your reaction to what happened, not based on other person dictating because of their aggression. That's why they're going to dictate that they're going to determine how you react. Even your pride should say, I'm not going to be controlled by someone else's anger or controlled by someone else's position. I want to know what I have to do, and then I'll do it methodically and well planned and well executed and reflected upon, and get the right objectivity. So the real challenge ultimately comes down to, with confrontations, it's an opportunity in a strange way of you rising to a place beyond yourself. So usually we think of confrontation as something like, we just don't want it in our lives. It's unwelcome. But on the other hand, once it happens, it's a real opportunity to rise to become a bigger person than you are. They say that, it says in the Talmud, if you want to extract olive oil, that's apropos to Hanukkah, you want to extract olive oil, you have to press the olive. Why did God make it that certain things have to be pressed? Because it's a lesson in life. Because sometimes it's only pressure that brings out the oil, the strength, and the real fuel from a person. I don't know, it was Eleanor Roosevelt, since we're talking about the Roosevelts, that said equal time for FDR. That said that, I don't know why they say it, but I guess a woman is like a tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her into hot water. Now, I don't know what that means about men. What do you do? When they're put in hot water, they just yell that it's hot, burning. I'm not trying to be anti-men here, but that's the way the line goes. Is this a Torah-based concept or not? Well, Eleanor Roosevelt, I don't know kind of authority she is, but she said it. I guess it's true to some extent. You do see it. Even in Jewish history, you find that all the challenging episodes in Jewish history, women were always the heroines. From Egypt, Hanukkah, Purim, and so on. You have them. I guess there's some type of vision or some type of resilience or strength that a woman may have that a man just doesn't have. Maybe things we can learn from. But the point is that no one welcomes confrontation just as Jacob did. Once it's there, one of the things that it does to a person is can hone and fine-tune who you are and what you stand for. And you have to sometimes fight for it. And sometimes fighting means not through fighting. Sometimes fighting is through getting what you want to get done, not through the fight. Sometimes the temptation is, I just want to get even. I want that person to really suffer, as they made me suffer. But if your intention is to get the goal reached, then there's something bigger than. And if the goal can be reached without that happening, that's always the wisest things. If you can get your goal and nobody knows you got it and nobody feels offended, that maybe is the biggest source of pride. But the problem is then there's no one to talk to about it. You can't tell anybody. So I don't know, that's another human quirk that we need to be able to tell somebody. What do they say about that story with God getting even with the Jew who was playing golf on Yom Kippur or something? That even though he shot a hole-in-one or something, he has no one to tell it to. So that's the curse. So you let it, it's like, excuse me. So I want to say on a concluding note, I wish upon all of us that we have the minimum amount of confrontations in our lives, especially the unhealthy ones, the ones that can destroy and consume you to no end. But at the same time, there are inevitably in life, because life it's not a perfect world, there are going to be many confrontations. And you can really see the difference between people under the circumstances, under the gun. But that's not just about how we see ourselves, it's more importantly what happens, how we deal with it. And I think it's a great exercise. So maybe next time you have a situation like that, maybe try something new, especially if it hasn't worked in the past, your methods, your strategies, and maybe introduce somebody that you can speak to, someone that can just look at it another perspective, and think about some of these ideas about how our emotions become part of the problem. Then you are equally the problem, not just the what do we say, adversary? Adversary. Okay. I have a short memory. Let's just stick to adversarial situation. That's fine? That's safe. Yeah, stay away. Yeah, adversity is my adversity, right? Like that. And ultimately recognize from Jacob's approach in his prayer the katenti, the humility. A similar statement was made, actually quoting this by the Bala Tanya, the author of the Tanya, who in a few days we celebrate his liberation from prison. So he too faced with confrontation. And some of the greatest lessons you learn from great people is not when things were going well, when things weren't going well, how they behaved. So as soon as he came out of prison, and it was a prison that was a result of his own colleagues, other Jews, informing on him. It doesn't get worse than that. Sitting in prison because other Jews informed on you because of jealousy or other stuff. And who did they inform? They didn't inform it like, American government. It was the Tsar government who could put you to death just like that. And he came out of prison. And he wrote this classic letter, which is published in Tanya, the second chapter of the fourth section of Tanya. And he begins with this verse in this chapter, because it was the week that he was liberated. He begins, Katenti mikol achsadim, I've been humbled by all the greatness that happened. And then he insists and tells his students, and himself of course, and everyone, do not gloat, and not go to the people that did this, and say, look, you see who won. And you can see a humility in that letter that's unbelievable. It's very similar to what Joseph did. That when Joseph meets his brothers, after years, 24 years that he was away, and why was he away? Because his brothers were jealous. They almost killed him. Instead, they sold him into slavery, threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery, and forgot about him. Told their father that he's dead. And that was it. They didn't even go search for him. So you'd think, after all those years, and Joseph rose to glory, became a leader, second in command, the viceroy of Egypt, and he finally meets, and they finally have their reunion. So you would think, I mean, at minimum, Joseph would let them have it a little. Instead, when they hide their faces, when Joseph exposes himself, when he says who he is, he tells them, he reveals his identity, and they didn't know it was him. He says unbelievable words. He says to them, they say, they were completely, how do you face your brother after what you did? There was no excuse. It was like, it's beyond, you can't even say, I'm sorry. It's so bad. So he says to them, do not feel that way. You did not do this to me. It is God that brought me here so that I could provide for you and the family. Because if I was not here, there would have been a famine, and we would all die from the famine. He had the presence to be able to not carry that grudge. And it says in the Zohar that because he was able to overlook, and I'm sure he had feelings, it wasn't like he didn't know what happened, but because he was able to overlook and look at a bigger picture and saw that a vision that because of him they were saved, basically. The nation was saved. It's true that as a result they ended up in bondage in Egypt, but as a result they also came out of Egypt a great nation. And he had that ability to step back and not look about him at his own comfort or discomfort. The Zohar says that in that merit, his children and grandchildren, it's unbelievable merit when a person overlooks. Now you could say, is that strength or weakness? You could say that's weakness. What do you mean? Why don't you confront? Is that functional? Somebody abuses you and then you just say, no, it doesn't bother me? Isn't that like an enabler? Using all our modern lingo. So it's true, if he was coming out of weakness and said it, and out of fear of them, then yes, that would not be healthy. But he was not coming out of fear. He was coming out of strength. He thought about it. And he made a decision. And his decision, what he made, was just as strong as if he would have confronted them. So it wasn't like going to war can be just as strong as going to war. Because it's not coming to prove anything. It's not coming to show, you're strong, I could also do this. You did this to me, I did that to you. That was not what Joseph was interested in. He learned from his father Jacob. You have to look at what the cause is. And if the cause is right, Jacob didn't care, I'll appease him. And that'd be a cute, you could say, you appeased him? For history will say, you're a weakling. Why'd you appease him? You have to bribe him? Your brother? Why don't you go to war? Why don't you show him that you're strong and maybe he'd stand down? Because the bottom line was that he didn't really care how he's going to be perceived. He knew that he has a goal. And his goal will be met this way. Let him be appeased. Let him feel good about it. I don't really care. And bottom line is the goal is met. And he achieved it, and it came from strength. The complicated part is to know what is strength. Is the strength to compromise, negotiate, or to confront? And that's why we need some of the objectivity. So, in the context of all of this, as I said, hopefully we have least confrontations. But when we do have them, and many times even with ourselves, being harsh with ourselves or being nice to ourselves, or the same with others, all these rules, or I guess these formulas apply. So I hope we can all learn some stuff from these messages, and you can review it again and again. We'll have a chumash. You can look into it and read into maybe other messages that I haven't mentioned here. And I'd be happy to hear if you find new, deeper, and other so-called insights. But it could really turn into a whole formula of negotiation, I guess, and mediation and confrontation, and maybe even not just on a personal level, maybe even on a global level. We're dealing with global confrontations. So, being that we're in the month of Kislev, which is on one hand a dark month, because prior to the miracle of Hanukkah, there was no oil, there was confrontation there too, and there too they had to rise to the occasion. So Hanukkah's message is very similar to this idea. I'm sure we'll discuss it as the weeks go along. So I want to say in that spirit as well that we're actually planning a pretty interesting Hanukkah event here. I don't even know what to call it because it's a party, but it's more than a party because we're trying to do like the story of Hanukkah in three movements, as in like the despair or the darkness dealing with the confrontation, and then discovering some hope, and then fanning that hope into a big flame, which is really the story of Hanukkah, those three. So we're going to do it through music and song, and you're going to have the honor to hear me sing a bit, and but not just that, and drums and narrative. It's quite interesting with the whole light experiences too. So I would definitely, last year the place sold out basically, so I would highly suggest if you want to participate, and I encourage you to do it as soon as possible. Just reserve your spot, and it should be a pretty memorable evening, I must say so myself. And I look forward to it. I'm going to have a rehearsal this week here. We're going to figure it out. I never really did a rehearsal before. That's why I usually just wing it. But here I think I want a little more choreography. I'm working with others, so I got to do it a little planned. I hope it doesn't disturb. I hope it doesn't undermine the effort. But anyway, that's in the spirit of all these things. And as you know, my goal with it is not just to have a nice party evening. That's always great, warm and energizing and noisy and all that, and good latkes and donuts and whatever else, beer. But above all, to go away with empowerment. To me, that's always the bottom line. If you can make people feel empowered and yourself empowered, and you can carry that into your life tonight and tomorrow, when we all go back to our so-called existential lonely space. I know I once said that in a place, and someone came to me, "Don't ever say that. It makes me cry every time you say existential loneliness." Said that Hadassah Kalbach, as a Kalbach, she told me that. So don't use that word. I don't use it when she's around. But if it makes anyone else cry, let me know. I won't use it. But when we go back to our so-called lonely place, and the place that you are with yourself, and there's no one else there, so if any class or program that can empower us that spills over to that, that's to me the sign of true success. It's not about the moment; it's about the follow-up. Like a couple I counseled, and they got married, and they said to me, they wanted to give me a gift. So I said, make a donation to Meaningful Life Center. It's fine with me. But I told them, just remember that maintenance contracts are much more expensive than getting the job done, because that's where the problem is. Not the getting you married; it's what's going to happen afterwards. That's always the challenge, the follow-up. So, in the spirit of the Meaningful Life Center, that's our mission, is not just to do nice things, but also empowerment to the point where it becomes a perpetual impact. Which really means that just if I've inspired you in any way, your responsibility is to inspire others in the same spirit as I've been. We're all part of one chain. It didn't begin here. It began long before me, and hopefully we can just continue it and make sure it doesn't stop. So that's your responsibility. So if you're getting something, you also have to give. That's my bottom line. So with that in mind, everyone have a very good evening. And as I said again, Hanukkah, 2 weeks from tonight, will be the Hanukkah party here, Wednesday night. Tomorrow night, Philip's class is at 7 o'clock, which is his own touch with the music, and singer-songwriter Philip. And next Wednesday, I shall be here again as well. So, good night, everybody. Thank you so much.